everybody. Good Tuesday morning. Welcome into a FreightWaves Now special report all about tracking tariffs. I'm Kaylee Nix, and it's great to have you with us as we continue to go through our coverage about what was a very exciting weekend and a very chaotic start to your week when it comes to tariff coverage. We've got three of our FreightWaves experts here on the line, and we're going to go ahead and bring them on in to talk a little bit about what went down on Monday morning and what it's going to mean for us going forward. So with us today, we've got John Gallagher, who's our Washington correspondent here at FreightWaves, John Kingston, who's our oil and energy expert, and Noi Mahoney, who does all of our Borderlands reporting. Starting things off with John Gallagher. John, thank you so much for being here. Talk to us a little bit about what's going on with the tariff situation. They were, and then they weren't. Now Canada and Mexico both have 30 days before they go into effect, but China is still on the hook as of this Tuesday morning. Give us an overview.
Yeah, so like you said, Kay, they were supposed to kick it in last night, and it still did for China. But that deal that Mexico and Canada came to yesterday, as we reported, it secured that 1 month delay. So barring any kind of and it was basically the exchange was to beef up security at the borders, and stop the flow of fentanyl, which was why Trump was doing this to begin with. But barring any kind of longer term agreement with Canada and Mexico, that would push it out to they would actually kick in on March 4th. And so we put a list, several lists together yesterday to kind of drill down on exactly what types of products that American consumers could potentially see. Basically, potentially a 25% price increase in a lot of these products. And so for Mexico, for example, cars and trucks and air conditioners, I'm just looking here, refrigerators, beer and tequila, flavored water, lots of produce that we get from Mexico. So that could be anything from like dates, figs, melons, avocados. We love Mexican avocados. Stuff you put in your salad, tomatoes, cucumbers, lettuce, onions, stuff like that. Now, and Canada, again, a lot of auto parts would be affected, finished plastic products, table and kitchenware. Lumber is huge from Canada, so that for a consumer, that could be things like plywood and wood that you burn in your fireplace. And also the aluminum, so it's like aluminum foil would be hit, and headphones, TV receivers. Now China, they still do have their the tariff is still in place there, and that's things like we have tons of stuff from China, as we know. But I just looked at some of the things based on a top 10 list of commodities that we import. So like all types of electronics, TV receivers, loudspeakers. Refrigerators, freezers, toys, games, sporting equipment. So that 10% China tariff not only still holds, but they actually came back last night and put on their own tariffs, which are much less evasive than the ones that we put on. But that's a 15% tariff on U.S. LNG exports and coal, and 10% on crude oil, farm machinery, and also a small number of trucks I saw, which I'm not exactly sure which type of trucks, but and that was going to start next week. And but again, that's a much smaller set of tariffs. So it seems it's more just about trying to negotiate a deal, which on other things. So that's sort of the status things are right now.
John, one of the other things that's come out that's really important to talk about is the de minimis exemption that was in place for goods coming from China, those low quality, very cheaply made goods, which the American consumer, of course, we know purchases a lot of these goods that are produced in China, but sometimes they get shipped to other countries before they're imported through the United States in order to kind of work around some of those restrictions. The de minimis exemption, which Eric Kulish has written a really good article about that's up on freightwaves.com, actually will likely impact the air cargo market it a lot. There was even a note saying that planes coming from China with these types of cheap goods on them would be just simply turned around and not allowed into the country. Do you have any clarity that you could give us on that exemption and what that means for the removal?
On the de minimis exemption, no, I didn't get more input on that. Although, since that is so many, so much of that comes in on those on that cargo, you could expect their when it comes down to the actual carriers themselves, that could come down to. I would assume that would affect things like how many carriers they put out there. If these type of products were to be harder to purchase, or that could affect, I guess, capacity, like cargo capacity or belly capacity, even in commercial carriers that they haul. So that would be something I would think about what might happen.
So if you want to read more on that, go to freightwaves.com and check out Eric Kulish's article. John Gallagher, thank you for your insight on this one. And we're going to move it to Noi Mahoney, our Borderlands reporter, to talk a little bit about that reaction coming back from both Canada and Mexico. Noi, thank you for joining us. And of course, we saw both Mexico's president and Canada's prime minister come back and say, okay, we're going to work with President Trump in order to delay these tariffs at 30 days. But what else was said in some of those conversations? And what does that mean in the broader picture for what could or could not end up being a trade war between us and our two neighbors?
Good morning. Well, thank you for having me. I'm sure a lot of the conversations were centered around the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement that was put into place in 2020. And Trump has been sort of vocal in saying that he wants to redo some of that trade agreement to benefit, the U.S. more. It has been largely successful from what people have told me, who work in the trade community, that the USMCA has been a very positive for all three countries. So I'm sure a lot of the trade discussions going on behind the scenes, with all three leaders of all three countries, has to do with what's going to happen with that trade agreement. What can Canada and Mexico do to sort of address this issue that President Trump has brought up in terms of immigration and drug smuggling, at the border, but also while not letting those two issues slow down trade between our three countries, which has been, a positive so far for these, past 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, both Mexico and Canada have consistently remained our top two trading partners really since the start of the pandemic. And a lot of that has come down to some of the reshoring and nearshoring efforts that are coming from companies that are choosing to set their locations in Mexico. And then, of course, the very close relationship that we've seen with Canada. Can you touch, maybe starting with Mexico, on what you think some of those relationships could end up looking like for some of those companies who moved production over to Mexico now that there's this extra level of uncertainty?
Yeah, that's a tough situation because this trade war, if you want to call it that, is producing a lot of uncertainty in terms of, market conditions. And for companies that are thinking of moving to Mexico, as we call it, the nearshoring movement, or companies that are already there, this may, make them rethink their supply chain strategy, their investment strategies in Mexico. Trump has this America First initiative, which is aimed at bringing, more manufacturing and more manufacturing jobs back to the U.S., which is a good thing. But, in terms of cost inputs, Mexico is just south of the border, and, there's so much manufacturing moving there that if it's hard to, switch supply chains in just a few years and move everything to another country, having to build new factories, having to get everything up and running, that takes years. And so a lot of companies have already done that investment, excuse me, in Mexico. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next, few months, year or so.
And speaking of that Bringing It Home initiative, it's a good opportunity to plug our program here at FreightWaves. Craig Fuller and JP Hampstead doing their best to highlight American manufacturing with that show Bring It Home. Go check them out. Noi, thank you for joining us this morning. We will keep an eye on your Borderlands articles as well. And right now, let's move it to our last guest with us. We've got John Kingston joining us, who is our oil and energy markets expert. Canada being a major producer when it comes to energy imports into the United States. John, talk to us a little bit about the response from the markets when the tariffs were dropped yesterday morning and then walked back by the afternoon.
Well, markets started surging on Sunday night U.S. time, as soon as the commodity markets opened. Everything surged. The West Texas Intermediate, Brent crude, ultra low sulfur diesel, and RBOB gasoline all began to surge. That's early all because of Canada. Canada is 40% of U.S. oil imports, and as far as like total crude throughput, it's like around 15 or 16% of all the crude that gets put through refineries in the U.S. is Canadian crude. The Mexican crude can go elsewhere. Remember something, the Canadian oil was only going to be impacted by a 10% tariff, not a 25% tariff, but that's not a small amount. The Mexican oil can easily just be shipped elsewhere and replaced by other oil coming in from somewhere else that's not tariffed, so that wasn't a big factor. The Canadian oil does not have a lot of alternatives, and the refineries in the Midwest, particularly the upper Midwest, that take a lot of it, do not have a lot of alternatives to substitute it for either. So as a result of that, the belief is that tariffs would cause higher input prices for crude and therefore higher output prices for products. What was interesting about the market was that when the 30-day pause on Mexico came out, and then later the Canadian prices, that the equity markets, which had been way down, bounced back to a large degree, and crude oil, which had been way up, started to come down as well. But the products didn't. The diesel didn't, and the gasoline didn't. And a lot of that is because crude is traded so much as a financial asset, as well as an oil product, I shouldn't say product, but as well as oil, whereas the products tended to be traded a little more on their own. So you get a lot of hot money, upside or downside, going into crude that maybe you don't get into products. So crude fell back and the products stayed up there. Today, quite frankly, there's not really much going on. There's not a lot of change in the market so far. So we'll have to see. But the tariffs on Canadian crude are a real problem because there's just not a lot of ways of getting around it. If you're a Midwest refiner, you've got pipeline connections that bring you in a lot of Canadian crude. If you're Canada itself, there's only so much more you can ship out of the west coast of Canada. There's some space on the main pipeline, but not a lot. So the two countries there on that issue are locked into a really tight relationship, and those tariffs are going to bite.
So, of course, the uncertainty aspect is the thing that I think sends the markets into this disarray the most, right? And we know that one of the major goals of the Trump administration is for the United States to be that sole energy producing powerhouse. Does that fact and that goal add any extra uncertainty in the markets? Or do we think that they're a little bit more confident knowing that, hey, okay, there's a pause on these tariffs and it's going to be maybe a slow rollout before the U.S. starts to ramp up that energy production?
Well, it's two issues. First of all, all this talk about the Trump administration wants to restore the U.S. role as a dominant energy producer. The U.S. is far and away the dominant energy producer. If you look over the entire sweep of things, crude oil, natural gas liquids, coal, coal's a little down, biofuels, whatever, we are the absolute king of the mountain. Okay, this is not really open for debate. There is also a feeling in the oil industry that the dynamics of the supply-demand dynamics going into 2025 are not particularly bullish. And the only reason that the market is hanging around $70 is because the OPEC Plus group has taken about 4.5 to 5 million barrels a day off the market through their restraint steps. And 4.5 to 5 million barrels of spare capacity sitting on the sidelines is an enormous amount, probably the biggest ever. So if you're an oil producer, and no matter how much you're being yelled at to drill, baby, drill, the fact is you kind of look at the economics, and they don't look real good. In the first Trump administration, the shale business was on a completely unsustainable process. They borrow a lot of money, they drill a lot of wells, they produce a lot of hydrocarbons, they pay back the banks, and they'd have no free cash flow. They're not going back to that. They are going to be profitable. They're going to pay dividends like a normal company. And so I think that the Trump administration and their followers who are thinking we're sitting on the top of some big surge in oil production are going to be disappointed.
All right, gentlemen, thank you all so much for joining us for this update. And of course, we will continue to watch the situation as it unfolds, talking about tariffs from China to Canada to Mexico. You can find all of our coverage up on freightwaves.com. As always, give us a follow here on the FreightWaves YouTube channel and on all of our social media. Stay tuned, and we'll have more as the situation continues to develop.